what is there to see here? It's just a bunch of rocks and sand. But I think even with that initial reaction of, it's just rocks and sand, Death Valley slowly, I think, creeps into everyone's heart. The extreme heat and aridity of Death Valley definitely give it a certain character. The feeling you get out here, maybe at first, is a bit unsettling. All this exposed rock and sand, there's not a lot of plants growing. You don't see a ton of wildlife out here. Feels like it could be sort of a dangerous place. Just the name itself, Death Valley, has a certain connotation that kind of evokes fear. But over time, as you recalibrate your senses, the exposed landscape here also can offer a sense of peace and stillness.
I always think of Death Valley as the most extreme desert in North America. And for extremes, it's the hottest, driest, lowest spot around. The hottest temperatures recorded in the world, the driest spot in the country, less than 2 inches of rain. And then down at Badwater Basin, minus 282 feet, the lowest spot in North America. When you look at the topography around here, you look at the huge mountain ranges, 6,000 to 8,000 feet on one side, 8,000 to 11,000 feet on the western side, that kind of traps the heat in. We have this low basin, low elevation, extremely dry air. So as Death Valley heats up during the summer, as a high pressure system settles over the west, that hot air rises, cools, it's kind of trapped in the valley, and it circulates there and heats up day after day until we get these extreme temperatures, usually in June, in July or August.
It's hard to describe the heat here, but one way I can describe it is that, everybody has a household oven. Turn that oven onto the highest temperature, let it heat up for a while, and then open the door, stick your face near it, and you feel that rush of that just hot, dry air coming out of your oven. That's what it feels like here. But a normal day in Death Valley, the wind is blowing, it's 120, 125 degrees, sometimes 130 degrees, and you have that forceful hot air blowing on you. Instantly evaporates the sweat that's coming off your body, instantly dries your clothes. You reach behind your ears and on your neck, and you wonder how all that crystallized salt got there, and that's you sweating without even realizing it. That's how hot Death Valley is in the summer. All of that combined makes it a very dangerous place.
When you think about the name Death Valley, of course the Tumpisha Shoshone don't refer to it as Death Valley. They think of it as Tumpisha, ground of fire. But for the rest of us, Death Valley was named in 1849. That party of gold seekers heading to the gold fields of California, looking for a shortcut. They passed through Death Valley in December, January, so it wasn't the heat of the year, but they got trapped in this basin. They didn't know where the water was. And as they were seeking their way out of the valley, as they were being rescued and led out of the valley, one of the members of that party, as the story goes, turned around and said, "Goodbye, Death Valley." Did that really happen? We don't know, but that's the tale we have to tell. And there's nobody else with another story that competes with it.
Well, the first word of our national park's name is death. So that's, I think, what immediately comes to mind. There's the death, there's the isolation factor here. People are actually surprised when they come to Death Valley to see more than just a flat salt pan that stretches out in either direction. They're They're amazed to see plants, they're amazed to see wildlife, they're amazed to see mountains. If you come in the spring, you'll see snow on those mountains.
I think the name gives people enough of a negative impression that it allows them to be pleasantly surprised when they see there's water, when they see there's oasis, when they see there's plants and animals that do survive here. That's a very positive. So that many people are like, well, why do you call it Death Valley? There's actually life here. We recently had comments in the visitor center where people said it should be called a hiker's paradise. And of course, living here as long as I have, I do think it is a hiker's paradise.
I love Death Valley National Park because of the feeling that I have while I'm here. I love the openness, I love the vastness, I love the magnitude of this park. I love that when you reach a certain point in Death Valley, you can look from one end of the park to the other and are basically limited by the curvature of the earth and how that makes you feel as a person. You know, when you can take in that much of the earth and you can take in that much of the landscape, it does start to make you feel very small and insignificant, which in turn puts a different perspective on maybe the problems that you're having or the day that you had at work or the argument that you had. It's an absolutely incredible place for placing perspective on things. A lot of people, when they think of our national parks, they want to go to Yosemite National Park or Yellowstone National Park, you know, which is great. Those parks are beautiful, but Death Valley National Park has everything that those parks have to offer. It has the incredible scenery, it has amazing wildlife, and one of the great things about Death Valley is it doesn't have the wall-to-wall visitors that other parks experience. I really do think that Death Valley is one of the hidden jewels of the National Park Service.
People expect Death Valley to be totally waterless and totally lifeless. With a name like Death Valley, that makes sense on all counts. But water is here. You just have to know where to look for it.
They know it's the hottest, driest spot. They kind of expect that, but they really don't know that there's so much water here. They don't know about the fact that we have millions of gallons of water at Furnace Creek, that the Saratoga Springs Oasis has these big, huge ponds of water, that there's multiple springs and water flowing out of the mountains of the Panamints. We often don't think about that, but there is water in Death Valley, and where there's water, there's life.
Water is so important in Death Valley that it's shaped everything that you see here, but it's mostly gone. You don't see it all the time. It may be here briefly from thunderstorms, it may be just in isolated spots, yet it's shaped everything. The most famous sites you see here have been shaped by water. Most people aren't even aware of that. You can see the remnants, you can see the ghost of that water on the landscape everywhere here. You can see the deep cut canyons, you can see the big alluvial fans, you can see the deposits on the salt flats. In a way, it's offering us something, showing us what has happened, but it's no longer there. It's just a ghost. Underlying Death Valley, there is a huge aquifer. This aquifer has very abundant water, and it's ice age water that has been traveling below the surface for tens of thousands of years. Yet here we are, the driest place in the nation, and the water's below the surface. You never really see it, except for a few places. And one of the best places to see it is a place called Devil's Hole. It's a limestone cavern that you peer down into this hole, you see the surface of the water. There's always water there. So it's a window into that ancient aquifer. Another ghost of water in Death Valley is something called Lake Manly. Can you imagine? Death Valley was once filled with a huge freshwater lake. This was as much as 600 feet deep at its deepest. It was a remnant of the ice ages when the region was much more wet and the drainage system was much wider. Water came all the way from the Sierra Nevada, even as far away as Mono Lake. That water would fill up the basins and make their way to Death Valley, which was the end of the line. And today, all of that water is gone. All that remains are remnants of lake shores and beaches and the salt flats. Death Valley gets less than 2 inches of rain a year, which is an amazingly small amount of rain.
And when you think about it, those moisture-laden clouds coming in from the Pacific, rising up over the Sierra Nevada, most of that moisture is released on the west side of the mountains. But we're not just in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada. We're in the rain shadow of a rain shadow of a rain shadow. So there's the Sierra Nevada mountains, then the Inyo Mountains, then the Panamint Mountains, and finally Death Valley, we receive very little rain.
If Death Valley is in such a dramatic rain shadow, you would think that no rain would ever get here. But winter storms don't always come directly from the west. Sometimes they circle around. It's rotating storms, and it can pull the moisture up from the south, or best of all, from the east. So those are the ones we love here because they're slow, they're gentle. The water can actually soak into the soil, which provides moisture for the widespread plants across the desert. It can cause the wildflower seeds to sprout, and we can have a wonderful bloom. Maybe if we're lucky, a super bloom can happen if enough rain comes. When it all falls into place, Death Valley can be transformed by fields of flowers.
When we have some wet years, the Amargosa River will flow in from the south and will actually have a temporary lake form in the bottom of Death Valley. We still refer to it as Lake Manly.
If you want to experience water in Death Valley, you can't just wait for a rainstorm because you never know when those are going to come. You have to go where the water's at. So there are places you can go see water, like Salt Creek, where there's a flowing stream of rare little fish that live in that one. You could go to Saratoga Springs in the far southern part of the park, where there's big ponds of water that attract birds. You could go to Darwin Falls on the western side of the park, where there's a spring-fed stream that pours down a deep canyon. The swimming pools at the Furnace Creek Ranch or the swimming pool at Stovepipe Wells are a place you can go and actually immerse yourself into that water. Something you have to remember if you visit Death Valley, you have to drink that water. It's very important. Without water, you can become very ill here. You have to keep hydrated. Always carry water with you. Always make sure you're drinking adequate amount. Water is life, and that's true anywhere you go, but it's most true here in Death Valley, in such a dry, incredibly harsh place. When you add water to this landscape, which looks so barren, it looks so sterile, just add water and life appears. It is key to all life here in Death Valley, whether it's a fish in the streams to those fleeting wildflowers that are only here for a brief moment. Water is what gives life to Death Valley.
I feel so humbled when I'm at the dunes. I've never felt this way before about a place. There's an immensity to the dunes. You feel like you're a visitor. You could never survive here on your own, but these plants have been able to accomplish that. It's not just a big pile of sand. It's a habitat to some of the rarest plants that we have. I'm in awe every time I come here.
When many people visit the desert or think of the desert, they think of this, of sand dunes. But in reality, only about 1% of deserts are covered in sand. In Death Valley, you can find several different sets of dunes, including the Ibex dunes, the Buckwheat dunes, Panamint dunes, the Mesquite Flat sand dunes, Saline Valley dunes, the Eureka dunes, my favorite because of their scale. It's like a mountain of sand.
Today we're in Eureka Valley doing the rare plant survey of the dune plants that live here. We're at the Eureka Valley sand dunes. They are approximately 700 feet tall, and they are the tallest dunes in Death Valley National Park. This information is going to be used to track the populations of these rare plants in accordance with the Endangered Species Act.
There are 8 different species of plants and animals that call Eureka Dunes home that live nowhere else in the world. We call these endemic species. All of them have one thing in common. they're stuck here. Mostly the beetles can't move very quickly, so they can't wander about and find other dune systems to move to. And a lot of the plants have lived here for thousands of years and can't escape the valley either.
The Eureka dune grass is what we call a relic species. It's actually more adapted for a marsh environment, we believe, and it's been able to survive in this valley because of the water availability that the sand provides. The evening primrose is sand adapted in that its branches bear new plants at the very tips of them, so that if it gets buried, it can grow up a new little plant.
Not only are these the tallest sand dunes in Death Valley National Park, but they're the loudest sand dunes in Death Valley National Park because they're the only dunes that sing and have their own song. The way the music works is, if allowed to dry deep enough, the contact zone between the hidden moisture and the dry will shift and vibrate, similar to a violinist playing their instrument. And they have to move, whether it be by footstep or a natural avalanche from the wind. The sand moves and they vibrate.
Sand is fun. They're a really fun place to be. I think there's something in all these little tiny grains of sand that makes you want to play with it.
Great for people of all ages, and there's nothing more fun than kicking off your shoes and running up and down the dunes, jumping around, playing around, and seeing the beauty of nature. In the hustle and bustle of everyday life, it's easy to get caught up in the speed of everything, but when you come here, the world really slows down, and it feels like a totally different place, an otherworldly experience. To me, sand dunes are a special place, especially here in Eureka Valley, because they offer that sense of solitude that many of us seek out in national parks. You can't really get that in a lot of other areas, but sitting alone on top of the tallest sand dune here, looking out over the valley, really stirs something deep inside you.
For dunes to form, you first have to have sand and wind and a trap that blocks the wind so that the sand can collect there. Sand comes from quartz materials in the mountains here, other rocks that have been ground down by sand and water actions. And the wind carries this sand to a place where it then starts to slow down. And at the point where the wind slows down is where the sand drops out of the wind and begins to form a dune.
Throughout the years, geologists have tried to identify the different types of sand dunes by the shape that they form. Some of the words we use are transverse and crescent and linear and star dunes, but at the end of the day, what really makes the dunes have the shape that they have is the wind, direction, and the way that the wind is broken to deposit the sand. So each dune has its own unique flavor and shape. Many of the dune fields within Death Valley National Park, including the Eureka Dunes, are protected wilderness areas. It's important not to drive on them and treat them with respect. Most visitors to Death Valley National Park will visit the Mesquite Flat sand dunes, which are very easy to access. They're a wonderful place for you to go and slide down the dunes.
To be in the middle of the sand dunes is to be in the heart of the desert. Your senses become awakened to the peace and the serenity of this otherworldly place. I invite you to come visit the sand dunes in your national park. They're a place where you can witness amazing sunrises and sunsets. They provide a refuge for animals and for us. They're a place where you can come to heal.
There's treasure everywhere at the sand dunes. Everywhere you go, you'll find something interesting. You'll find something unique. The dunes are one of the easiest places to have an adventure in Death Valley.
In a mining town at the turn of the century, you would have heard the stamp mill for miles around. It was a deafening sound. And today, if you stand in Skidoo, all you really hear is silence. And you can sit and think in that silence about how life may have been here over 100 years ago. You can look at the stamp mill and imagine what it may have sounded like. You can rummage through some of the old broken bottles or tin cans that were left behind and try and imagine what those would have held or who would have discarded them. And this place is really interesting to do that with. And these are really important things for us to be able to continue to study and look at and remember. Death Valley's history is really tied into mining, and it's a very different way of life than I think we experience today. So being in Death Valley or being in a place like Skidoo really gives you kind of a window into a bygone era. Many people have come through Death Valley looking for riches and trying to strike it big. Most of these people ended up failing. Some places, though, did actually thrive in Death Valley, and Skidoo is kind of one of those places. It ended up turning a profit, which is not what quite a few of the mining operations in this area did. In 1906, there were two men that discovered it and very quickly sold it to a man named Bob Montgomery. He over-speculated the town and really thought that this place would last and become a very large mining community for the area. There were tent cities that sprung up in the area, and hundreds of people, miners and workers, came to be here and to be at Skidoo and work this mine. And it really didn't last very long. The post office was put in place here in 1907, and then by 1908, pretty much everything had folded in this town. There isn't much left of the town site at Skidoo, but the stamp mill is pretty spectacular. It's one of my favorite places in the park that has mine resources. The stamp mill is where they crush the ore and were able to do some of the extraction so that they could actually extract that gold.
Skidoo was either the biggest or the second biggest gold mine in Death Valley, Keen Wonder being the other. Production-wise, probably the biggest. And the Skidoo mill is one of the best preserved in all the Mojave Desert and was one of the few that was actually powered with water. So you'll notice the mill is built onto the side of a steep hill. This is actually fairly common for milling operation. And the reason is a lot of times the milling process involves multiple steps. And when you build on the side of a hill, you can line up all your equipment in sequence and then use gravity to move the ore from one section to the next. So here we are at the top, where ore is first introduced to the mill. And we have a platform and a large ore bin. Now, originally, ore was transported to the mill via wagon. However, in the 1930s, when Skidoo was mined for the second time, dump trucks were used. And this structure actually was built in the 30s. It's sturdier. It was made to accommodate the larger loads. So here we are. We're now at the bottom of the ore bin. And we're at the start of the milling process. So this piece of equipment right here is known as a jaw crusher. And the first step in milling is to break the ore down. The ore comes out of the bin, goes in the crusher, gets reduced in size, and then is fed along a conveyor belt that's no longer present down into a second ore bin above the stamp mill. After going through the jaw crusher, the ore goes on the conveyor belt down to the second ore bin and then it's fed down here to the stamps. There are 15 stamps, and these would alternate. They would go up and down, be dropped onto the ore, and they'd pulverize it into sand. And all this was powered with water from the Skidoo pipeline. So these going up and down, you have metal banging on rock, making a tremendous noise. And this is all enclosed inside a metal building. Stamp mill workers were some of the best paid workers on the site, but part of the trade-off was that most of them went deaf within a few years. In fact, it was so loud inside these mills that they would have to communicate with hand signals. The action from the stamps was so violent that in many mills, including this one, the stamps were put on their own foundation so that they didn't shake apart the whole building. So after the ore is pulverized from the stamps, it comes over and comes down over these amalgamation tables. These tables would have looked a bit different when they were in production because they would have been covered with copper plates, and the copper plates would have been brushed with mercury. The purpose of crushing the ore is to separate the gold from the rest of the material. After going through the stamps, the gold that had been separated, which is known as free gold, would come down onto these plates and would bond with the mercury and would form amalgam, which is essentially a paste. And once enough gold had gone over and you had enough amalgam, it was saturated basically, someone would come along, scrape it off, and then brush more mercury onto the plates. For the gold that was still attached to other material, it would continue on down to the next level, cyanide processing. Now these cyanide tanks would all have been filled with sodium cyanide solution, and the ore would have been put in them for a number of days, long enough for the gold to be separated from the rest of the material. The gold would bond to the solution, and then eventually for recovery, what's known as the pregnant solution would be removed and run through a box of zinc shavings. And then after all that work, the miners finally had their gold. The Skidoo mill is very fragile, and it's important to remember that you should never climb on this or any other historic structure. Not only is it dangerous, but it's also against park regulations. And of course, anytime you're in a national park, leave everything as you found it. Don't take anything from the site, natural or mining related. One of the things I'd like to stress is that when people visit these sites, they shouldn't be going into the mines. You know, we have a motto, stay out, stay alive, and it's for good reason.
I really enjoy going to mine sites, especially in Death Valley. It really gives me a connection to the past. It gives me a connection to this place, and whether 1,000 people have seen it before or I was the first person to have seen it in 100 years, it still feels like I'm discovering something by coming to these places and by looking at these things and by touching something that someone might not have touched for well over 100 years. It's really kind of a powerful thing to feel like you're discovering something. And especially in Death Valley, I feel like there's a lot to discover.